A mother grips her crying infant, convinced the tiny body is nothing human. The changeling myth gave her just one answer: hold the child over the fire to force her real baby back. In medieval Europe, unexplained disabilities or sudden regressions meant fairies had stolen your child. But the truth behind this legend is more horrifying than the story itself, and it is hidden in the brutal cures that followed. What happens when ancient superstitions cross with parental desperation? Stories whispered around peat fires warned parents to keep a close watch on their cradles. In the villages of medieval Europe, the threat of the changeling was never far from mind. Neighbors spoke of fairies, called the good people in Ireland, the hidden folk in Scandinavia, or trolls in the Black Forest, who slipped through open windows or cracks beneath the door. Their aim? To steal away a healthy human child and leave behind something else. The warning signs were passed down by word of mouth. A baby who wailed through the night, who would not feed or seemed oddly silent, became a source of dread. Some said you could spot a changeling by its strange appearance: an oversized head, swollen belly, thin arms, or a twisted back. Others pointed to uncanny wisdom, a child who seemed older than its years or who watched with unsettling, knowing eyes. An infant who bit or screamed, who never smiled or met their mother's gaze, was marked as suspect. In Irish cottages, mothers guarded newborns against abduction by laying iron tongs across the cradle or tying red ribbons to tiny wrists. In Germany, tales warned of elves or Wechselbalge, swapped babies who drained their families' food and patience, never thriving, always restless. Welsh stories named them Plentyn Newid, and in Poland, the Mamuna lurked in the shadows, searching for unbaptized infants. The rituals of protection became part of daily life. Windows were shuttered tight after sunset. Fathers would spit 3 times before entering the house, or mothers would dress their boys as girls to confuse the fairies. Despite these efforts, a sudden change in a child, loss of speech, a fever that lingered, or a once cheerful baby who grew sullen and limp could spark panic. The belief ran deep. If your child changed overnight, the real one was gone, spirited away to dance in the fairy mounds or serve in the halls beneath the hill. Village storytellers kept these fears alive, weaving caution into every tale. In their world, the line between the natural and the supernatural was dangerously thin. A mother's grief or a father's suspicion could tip a family into action, convinced that only by exposing the imposter could they hope to bring their true child home. The changeling myth was not just a story, it was a kind of warning, a way to make sense of the unexplained, and a shadow that hovered over every cradle. Descriptions of changelings in medieval Europe read today like case notes from a pediatric clinic, but stripped of medical understanding. A baby who stopped smiling, who never looked into a parent's eyes, or who screamed at every touch was not seen as ill, they were believed to be something else entirely. The changeling myth mapped perfectly onto what we now recognize as neurodevelopmental and genetic conditions. Autism spectrum disorder, for example, is defined by persistent deficits in social interaction and communication, often with repetitive behaviors and unusual responses to sensory input. Folklore described changelings as infants who would not speak, who shrank from affection, who stared blankly or fixated on flickering firelight, lost in their own world. A child who once babbled and reached for their mother, then suddenly withdrew, was thought to have been swapped by the fairies. Modern clinicians call this regression. In the Middle Ages, it was a sign that the real child was gone. Other changeling traits line up with Down syndrome. Stories mention infants with broad faces, small noses, short limbs, or a slack, foolish expression, features that now signal a genetic difference, but then marked a child as uncanny. Some were described as perpetually hungry, yet thin and weak, echoing what doctors call failure to thrive. The paradox, ravenous appetite but wasted body, was written off as evidence of supernatural origin, not malnutrition or metabolic disorder. Historical records show that these children often became the focus of communal anxiety. In a world where every family depended on the labor of its members, a child who could not work, who drained food and care without growing strong, was seen as a threat to survival. The changeling label did not just explain the inexplicable, it justified desperate measures. Medical anthropologists warn against reading modern diagnoses too literally into the past, but the overlap is striking. Parish registers and folk tales describe children who stopped speaking, failed to walk, or grew crooked and old before their time. Today, these patterns point to autism, Down syndrome, or severe illness. Then, they mark the boundary between human and other. The changeling myth was a cultural diagnosis, a way to make sense of suffering, but also a dangerous permission slip for what came next. A mother lifts her infant from the cradle, convinced the child before her is not her own. In kitchens and cottages across Europe, the rituals begin. The first test is fire. The baby is stripped and balanced on a shovel, held over burning turf or glowing coals. Sometimes, a live coal is pressed to the soles of tiny feet. The goal is to make the changeling scream, to drive out the fairy, or force a confession. In Germany, parents thrust suspected changelings near ovens, believing the devil's brat would flee the heat. Another remedy is foxglove tea. The leaves of the foxglove plant are boiled into a bitter brew and forced past the child's lips. Foxglove, known today as digitalis, is a powerful poison. In Ireland and Wales, deaths from these concoctions are recorded into the late 19th century. Survival is rare. If the child vomits and lives, some say the fairies have released their hold. If not, the outcome is often fatal. Exposure comes next. The infant is carried into the woods or left on a cold hillside at dusk, sometimes wrapped in nothing but a thin cloth. Parents watch from the shadows, waiting to see if the fairies will take back their own and return the real child by morning. Many do not survive the night. There is also the egg-shell test. The mother boils eggshells in a pot, acting out the absurd, hoping to trick the changeling into speech. When the child, said to be ancient in years, finally speaks, "I am as old as the hills, yet never have I seen the like," the verdict is sealed. The next steps are often more violent. These acts were not only accepted, they were sometimes encouraged by religious leaders. Martin Luther, the Reformation's great voice, described such children as a mass of flesh, lacking a soul, and advised that a changeling should be drowned. In these words, the line between superstition and doctrine blurs. The violence is given moral cover. The child's suffering is justified as a test, not a crime. On a cold night in March 1895, the small community of Ballivadlia, near Clonmel in County Tipperary, became the stage for a crime that would haunt the Irish courts. Bridget Cleary, a 26-year-old dressmaker, lay weak with fever in her cottage. Her husband, Michael Cleary, insisted she was not his wife, but a changeling sent by the fairies. Over several days, Michael and a circle of relatives and neighbors subjected Bridget to a series of so-called cures. Bitter herbal drinks were forced down her throat. She was held near the fire and threatened, the language of fairy lore echoing around her sickbed. Witnesses later told the court that Michael demanded again and again, "Are you my wife or a fairy?" On the night of March 15th, the violence reached its peak. Bridget was forced to swallow more herbs, then doused with lamp oil, and set alight in front of a half-circle of family and friends. Michael Cleary stood over her, shouting that he would drive out the fairy once and for all. When the flames died, Bridget was dead. Her burnt body was buried in a shallow grave just beyond the cottage. The trial that followed drew crowds to the Clonmel courthouse and filled the newspapers with talk of superstition and murder. Testimony from neighbors, a priest, and police made clear that belief in fairy abduction still held power in rural Ireland. Michael Cleary, along with several accomplices, stood accused of murder. The jury, faced with the tangled mix of folklore and violence, found Michael guilty of manslaughter, not murder. The verdict revealed that Even as the 20th century approached, the old stories could still shape the law and cost a woman her life. Centuries later, disability stigma still kills, just behind hospital doors instead of cottage fires. Misunderstanding breeds new forms of cruelty when we label difference as threat. We decide, even now, who deserves care. The real monsters are never mythical. They live in the choices we make. Join the conversation below.